Hello, and welcome to another episode of Cultivate. And we are so glad that you can join us for this special episode where we're meeting in Salt Lake City in the historic Skaggs Memorial Chapel at First Baptist Salt Lake City for our annual meeting. And we are excited to have our special guest, who was a guest speaker here also at our annual meeting, is Reverend Dr. Hrang Hlei. And you're also a longtime friend of Evergreen. You were part of our Evergreen Churches, Seattle Chin Baptist.
Yes.
And I thought, so many of us know you, but there are other people, maybe our listeners, who might not be familiar with you. So I thought maybe you could just tell us what you're currently doing, what you're up to, and a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great opportunity for me to have this time to sit with you. First came to Evergreen, I would say, Seattle, Washington, 2015. And then in that year, as I mentioned last night, I was ordained by Evergreen Association. That's when I began my full-time pastoral ministry. And then it was here, at Evergreen or Seattle for 4 years, and then moved to Indianapolis, where we now live. Currently, what I've been engaged mostly is obviously about, Burma. What has happened in Burma 3 years ago, almost 4 now, the people especially are really suffering. Many of them died, many of them have to flee to neighboring countries like India, like Mizoram State, and even in Malaysia. And in Malaysia itself, there are a number of people from Burma, and then the Chin people and many other ethnic groups are in Malaysia as well. So I've been engaged with people like BAG, Burma Advocacy Group, organized and led by Reverend Dr. Roy Medley. So under BAG, I am assisting Reverend Leslie Turley in the Education Working Committee, working for the education of mainly we are focusing on the Malaysia, how we can help provide education needs for people in Malaysia. So that's kind of like my main engagement in my ministry, apart from a full-time pastor in a congregation in Indiana. Another related to that is humanitarian aids. Within the Chin Baptist Churches USA, where I'm part of, we have what we call Chin Humanitarian Relief Committee. So I'm a part of that group. So with that, we have a global level, we call it Global Chin Humanitarian and Relief Committee. We are meeting every month, like the first or second week of the month, and talk about how we can provide help and support to the IDPs and what we call CDMers, civil disobedient movement people, like who were like teachers or government employees and so many other people who were in government offices quitting their job in protests of the military dictatorship. So there's thousands of our people who really need humanitarian aids. Right. So mainly I've been engaged in that area particularly, apart from.
Yeah, as you know, the Evergreen family has a number of Burma churches, right? You were at the Seattle Chin Baptist, but we also have Phalam, we have Kachin, Karen.
Yes.
And this is a growing complex issue. Each ethnic group has their own kind of perspective on it. But maybe if you could help us as the listeners in the Evergreen family, like what are ways that we can support this kind of humanitarian work that you're doing? Like what could we tangibly do as Evergreen churches in partnering with your important work?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think important question as well. The local churches in the Evergreen area, they've been struggling in their own way, especially related to that humanitarian support. Yeah. Each local churches have been supporting people back home in terms of financial, in terms of material support. They've been doing collections for that purpose, and yeah, collection from the central organization and collection from the local people. We need help. Please support us. Please help us. So if you approach and ask questions to the churches in Seattle area, the Kachin, the Karen, the Chin, I think their response will be almost the same. They have been providing support, help. So if Evergreen in any way, engage with the local congregation and in areas that, Evergreen can be able to provide any help, that would be really helpful. Yeah. Especially this time of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I notice like when we talk about these kind of issues, sometimes like if you're maybe of a different ethnicity or different ethnic caucus, like the first thing you're thinking is like, yeah, just give humanitarian aid. But I like what you're saying because it's more about stuff is already happening. You don't have to do it by yourself. Like identify the people that are doing the work and get to know them and join what they're already doing.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I think sometimes what can happen from people who are not of color or not that background, they mean well, but they're trying to help, but they have no relationship with the people they're helping. Exactly. And I think is this fair? Like Asians, we get suspicious of people who are trying to help us, and we don't know who they are. It's like but we have to do the hard work of like getting to know them, earning their trust, not coming in from above, but like coming as partners. And that's when it gets really exciting in terms of partnering for God's work. And I think I'm still trying to learn about that too, because even though I'm East Asian, my story is very different than the people of Burma. And then even talking to the Karen church and the Kachin church, I'm like, oh, it's different stories.
Yes.
And it takes time to get to know. And I think all of us would do better if we can make space to learn. And
I think so. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. And I think since you mentioned that, when I was in Seattle, sometimes, for example, when the Marcia Patton was executive minister, sometimes we invite her to have fellowship with us. Yeah. Sometimes she herself, come and spend some time with us. And also the current executive minister as well. Sometimes we invited, and sometimes he, would tell us that he wants to come and visit with us. And even in, I think it was March of this year, Seattle Chin Baptist Church had their Silver Jubilee celebration. Yeah. So he was there. Right. So getting to know them, acquainted with them, who they are and what they're doing, I think to get to know them is very important. Yeah. Sometimes, tell us what you need. We'll give you, or we'll help you is one thing. Yeah. But at the same time, going with them and spending time with them, engaging with them, and knowing them personally. Yes. And the need will automatically be kind of there, and whatever help or support Evergreen can provide or anyone can provide, I think that will naturally go together. That will be, I think, meaningful. Yeah. Meaningful.
Yeah, and I think we're identifying something. If you agree with me about Asia is a very big category, but I think a real commonality of Asian culture is that we value family and relationships very much. Absolutely. Right. And that gets me to think about when you're talking about that, I'm thinking about generations now, thinking about young people, old people, and I'm a second generation of Korea. So my parents immigrated, and I grew up in Canada. And you immigrated. Well, I mean, you came over. Did you? And then you have a generation underneath you, thinking about those relationships. I was just thinking, like, what are ways that you also try and strengthen the ties between generations within the Chin community? Like, so we were talking about external relationships, but even within, like, the internal relationships of generations, what are ways that you see, like, how you'd like to build up those relationships?
Very challenging, I would say,
Yeah.
and good questions as well. We used to call it generation gap. The first generation, the second generation, or the 1.5 generation, or something like that. Obviously, as second generation or young people, most of them are growing up here in America. In a way, in a kind of like individualistic culture, and the Asian or the non-Western people, our culture in general is more communal.
Right.
So when it comes to first generation, second generation relationship within the church, there tends to be, some conflict, not obvious, but sometimes tension within that generation.
Right.
I think what is important for us is we can't really, the first generation cannot really hold on to our culture or whatever tradition we have, transfer to our second generation, because the second generation young people are influenced or grew up here in this culture. So in one way or another, I think there needs to be some sort of transition from the first to second generation. So I think the mutual understanding or learning from each other, even though it's very challenging, is very important. And it's not an easy one.
Yeah.
But that's something we need to really focus on.
Yeah. It's very complicated, isn't it? Because you're not just talking about generational gap, right? You're talking about cultural gap,
Yes.
and even language gap, right?
Yes.
Because a lot of them are born here, they can't communicate in their heart language both ways.
Yes.
And there's so much about the Chin culture that is so precious and loved by God, and we don't want to see it go away. But then we also need to recognize they're in a different world, right? Like, they have their own culture. So how do we kind of honor and respect that culture, but also recognize they're forming their new culture? Yeah, and we have to honor them too. And it's a very difficult navigation between the two, I think. Because you're very modest, but you are an associate pastor in a very large church doing congregational care for the entire church in Indiana, Chin Baptist. And in your observations ministering to the younger people there, what were some of the interesting things that you've discovered?
The interesting thing, in a way, many of our younger generations at this point are interested in the church. Most of them are within the church community. That's, I think, a good thing, a good sign. But at the same time, for them to keep that church culture or the Christian thing or the church thing to the next generation, I think the challenge for us as pastors or leaders is how do we train them, how do we equip them in the Christian way at the same time as they grow up in this culture. It's I think, very important for us. What we do usually in our church is that I think many of the Chin churches is that in terms of maintaining like our own tradition and culture. For example, in my church, we have what we call a culture and social committee. That committee usually organizes our annual culture appreciation week or something like that. We just did it actually last week, and I preached. And in my sermon, what I mentioned was in terms of engaging our young people or training them or equipping them for God's ministry, the church ministry for the next in the future, is that we have to engage in the way they are familiar with. When it comes to culture, it's a broad term. Yeah. But within that culture, language is one of them. Yeah. And many of our young people are familiar with English, or English seems to be their first language, and Chin is kind of their second language, right. Or vice versa. Right. But when it comes to teaching them the Word of God, yeah. I think we have to use kind of like English as kind of like the first language, and then the Chin language is kind of like the second language, something like that. But vice versa. But we can't really try to maintain only the Chin culture, only the Chin language, yes. And then ignore the English. Oh, this is. Yeah. I think we have to keep both.
Yeah, that is a delicate dance. I really understand what you're saying, because growing up in a Korean church, sometimes the service is all in Korean, Bible studies in Korean, but then that wasn't my comfortable language. I didn't know, I couldn't speak it as well. So I'm not engaging with the content. I'm not engaging with God. Yeah. It's not my heart language. But at the same time, when I'm trying to interact with my elders, right? If I'm trying to make them adjust to me, it's they're not. I can't address their heart language or whatever. And so I think it's kind of about learning. Like, language is like, it's about serving each other, right? Yeah. It's about accessibility, right? Like, when we come together, can you speak and interact with God in what your heart language is, whatever that means? Rather than like imposing it on people, right? And forcing it on them, right? And I think that's very difficult because we're in that transitional time as immigrants, is that we need to have really skilled bilingual spaces, and that's very difficult. And I think a lot of monocultural churches don't understand how hard that is, right? Yeah. But as we're talking about this more, this is a very complicated problem, and I'm very interested in this because of my own personal story. But again, you're very modest. You haven't mentioned at all that you're also the Associate General Secretary of the Chin Baptist Churches of the U.S. And so you get to have a vantage point of all the Chin Baptist churches and the ministry that's going on. And we're just talking about how young people are interested in the church. Yeah. And we had a conversation earlier that you were mentioning that a lot of young Chin people are interested in ministry. Yeah. And so I was just wondering, as maybe, I mean, you're not that old, but as an elder, right, over the younger people, if there was some wisdom that you might want to impart to younger Chin people who are discerning ministry, is there maybe some kind of wisdom that you'd like to impart to them?
Yeah, I mean, first, are young people, interested in ministry or engaging in ministry is really a blessing. Yeah. Because I call myself a 1.5 generation. I don't want to call myself a first generation. but for young people, interested in serving God or being in ministry, it's really a blessing. It's really happy to see them. But at the same time, speaking from my context, I don't know whether it's related or not. We have to understand. We have to know who we are and where we came from. So I mentioned a little bit last night in my sermon as well. the Chin people, Christians in Burma, the first missionaries were Baptist missionaries.
Right.
So we have to kind of like remember that our beginning, we should not forget our beginning.
Yeah.
So as the young people engage in ministry, the Western culture, American community is very wide community, and with understanding and knowing that, the origin of our story, I think when we go forward in the future, I think that will be really helpful for us. In other words, to maintain the relationship, our relationship with American Baptist churches in the future. I think that for our young leaders, I think it's very important for them to really think about it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was just speaking with our other guest speaker, Reverend Dr. Lauren Ng, and we were just talking about the importance of storytelling. And, just to realize that we have a long story. So for young Chin people, it's like, yes, America is a part of your story, but there's a story before that too. Yeah. And you need to know the whole story. Yes. Because I think even in my own identity as a Korean, Canadian, American, I had to learn about where I came from so that I could make my story going forward. Yes. Because if we just sort of think that the story starts with us, it's a very shallow and superficial. Yeah. And it doesn't really understand all the complexities that got me to this place. And so I think that's great insight, is that the most important thing I think for young people is know your story and follow it, see where it goes, and see what the Spirit tells you as you discover this. Yeah, because you're going to have to tell that story to the generations after you. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I think that's really profound. I'm so grateful for you. I don't know if I fully ever got to say this, but I remember when I first met you, we were at an Asian American colloquium. And, your work in Evergreen. But the more I talk with you, I'm just so grateful that there's someone like you in the Chin community. Just, you've been extremely humble. I feel like I could spend the whole episode talking about all the things you do. You also have, a doctorate, you teach, you speak 4 languages, is that right? Or is it 5?
Languages within our country, because Burma, and maybe a different topic, but Burma, we have hundreds of ethnic languages. Yes. So I speak Chin, within Chin different tribes as well. Yes. Right. And Burmese is the main language, so Burmese, something like that, yeah. Yeah, but they're not just dialects, they're languages, right? Yes. They're separate languages, and that the fact that you can speak these, and that you also have this scholarly reflection in your life, you also have ministry experience. I'm grateful for folks like you, because I think there's a need for what I'd call this bridge maker generation. And I think that unfortunately they need to be multilingual. They do need to be very reflective, and they do need to do the homework, because this is such a fragile time. Yeah. Because the generation to come needs these people who can translate the past and understand the two cultures and stand in the gap. Yeah. And it will require really exceptional people like yourself and others. So why I really wanted to get you on this podcast is just encourage you, but also anyone who might be watching this, is that there is a real calling, I think, for bridge people who can see 2 worlds, right? I think so, yeah. Yeah, and translate it to each side. Yeah. Because that is something I didn't have growing up. And if I had a mentor like you who was able to kind of understand both worlds, it would have been so helpful for me in my experience. So just really grateful that you're there at that church and that you're able to do that translation work. And, if there's anything that you can do to empower more people like you, just want to really encourage you in that. So, there's so much more we can talk about, but I'll just maybe pause and wrap up here. But I'm so grateful for you. Thank you so much for coming for our annual meeting.
and you've truly been a blessing.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is really an honor for me and a blessing for me, because my coming to this gathering is, my presence itself, I would say, because of when I look at the participants.
Yes.
Maybe some people who are, participating in online and from distance, but in person gathering, I think I am the only person from Burma.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think I'm representing my Burmese friends as well.
Yeah.
So it's a blessing for me.
Yeah. Well, we hope for more in the next annual meeting. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you ever want to follow up with anything that we've discussed, please reach out to the region. We'd love to hear from you. All right. See you next time.